Can we get one more round of applause for all of our award winners? So I'm pleased to turn the program over now to these two women on my left. And we're doing something this year for the first time, kind of a fireside chat. And I think that on issues where there are nuances, I think it's really important to have people be able to have organic conversations, to be able to sort of feed off each other and talk about the issues in a way that is more conversational and sometimes can be more applicable or understandable to a larger audience. So today we're going to do a fireside chat amongst Title IX experts, and we're going to talk about how the chaotic and evolving legal and economic framework of college athletics impacts gender equity. You've already met Julie Summer, our executive director, who I would like to publicly thank for all of the hard work putting this together and for only sending me a few messages with our 8-hour time zone difference. So if we could just give Julie another round. And to Julie's left is we can call her a superstar, Title IX litigator. I think that's fair. Lori Bullock is recognized as one of the American Academy of Trial Lawyers' top 100 plaintiff attorneys. And Lori has forced more than 15 different universities to commit significant additional resources and create new opportunities for their women student athletes. She's obtained hard-fought relief from some of the most prominent programs in the country, including Michigan State University, Clemson University, and Florida State. So with that, Julie and Lori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you.
As you know from the program, this is more of a fireside chat minus the fire, but we'll bring the warmth here. So we're pretty much going to cover Title IX and Olympic sports in the current chaotic landscape, as we've been discussing all morning, especially with the House case and where Lori's been working for years now, pre-House. So we'll begin with setting the table a little bit and to how we got to where we are now. And we'll really set the table with going back to the law that we're discussing. Title IX was passed in 1972. It wasn't a sports law, but has become synonymous with providing opportunity for women in sports. Lori, was there a singular event that became the case? Was it a gradual thing?
Well, I think, just starting out in 1972, after the passage, the Department of Education, which at the time was under a different title for an agency, issued guidance which included athletics. And at that point, that sort of opened up the can of worms of, does this apply to athletics? If it does, how are we going to implement this? You saw a series of amendments proposed to Title IX to try and exempt football, to try and exempt revenue-producing sports, all of which failed. And then we ended up with what we call the policy interpretation, but it's the federal regulations that implement Title IX and lay out the different areas of compliance, which include, that there needs to be equal participation opportunities, there needs to be equal treatment and benefits, and there needs to be equal athletic financial aid. And this is all premised on from the start that, because athletics is very unique, that universities, schools, all the way down to elementary school, any institution that's covered is allowed to have a sex segregated athletic department, and they're allowed to segregate by sex. And in order to make sure that they're doing that in a way that is equal and promotes equity, all of the guidance that, came out so that we made sure, the idea was we made sure women were getting the same opportunities as men.
It's interesting when you think about those efforts over 50 years ago now to exempt football. We have some of those similar pressures now, right? With NIL, revenue sharing, which we're going to get into.
We will.
But a lot of people are really thankful that those efforts failed to exempt football, because it essentially made all the difference for girls and women 50 years ago.
Absolutely. I think if that would have passed, we'd be looking at a very different landscape for women's athletics right now. But I will tell you that the universities are still making the argument that football is different and shouldn't be included. So it's not something that's died out.
Right. So we're 53 years later now. We have women's professional leagues. We have the WNBA, another new women's professional basketball league. Of course, we've had golf and tennis. We have soccer, the NWSL since 2012. Recently, professional women's hockey. We're not playing half-court basketball anymore.
Yeah.
And we have at WNBA games, little boys who are fans of women's sports and women athletes, dads wearing Title IX shirts, little boys wearing Title IX shirts. How far have we come in the last 5 decades, and what has surprised you about the growth of women's sports, if anything?
I think, how we've come so far. We really have, and I know we're still here and we're still having this conversation about inequity between men's and women's sports, but we really have come a long way. The most recent NCAA participation reports show that the increase in participation just itself was the biggest last year that it has been in the last 50 years. So we have more women participating in sports than we've ever had before. And I will say, as a student who I played every sport I possibly could in high school. They only let you play one per season, but I think I would have done more than that if it would have been possible. That I'm not surprised, because I think, there were people like Donna Lopiano. There were people in the 70s that knew women really love to play sports. That stereotype isn't accurate, as most aren't. So I'm not surprised about the growth. I am pleasantly surprised about the growth in the professional side of women's sports. And that was made possible by Title IX and by having all of these opportunities available for, female students.
What are or have been the issues with Title IX in colleges when it comes to sports?
Well, unfortunately, the issues that we have and that we've litigated haven't changed a whole lot since we started litigating Title IX issues in the 90s, before I was an attorney. And the issues we have are, we still have 90% of, Division I universities that are out of compliance with prong 1 of participation opportunities. Obviously there are 3 prongs, the quick and dirty. Those 3 would just be the universities basically as a way to give them a little bit of breathing room. The regulations came out and said you can have substantial proportionality, where the number of student athletes you have mirror your undergraduate population. That's your safe harbor. If you can't meet that, then you can demonstrate that you have a history of expanding women's opportunities.
Prong 2?
Prong 2,
Okay.
yep, in line with, the increased interest and ability. At this point, that's not a real defense for basically any institution, because, they've had 50 years to add women's sports. They might be adding here and there occasionally, but we're not talking about the type of growth that was contemplated, when that was passed. And then they have a defense where they can say, well, we've met all of the interest and ability that exists at our institution. And, we couldn't add another team that would actually have an opportunity to play in the geographical area where we compete. And so when we're looking at compliance, because we know there is so much unmet interest and ability amongst female student athletes, you have women clamoring to get on club teams. You have, more female more female athletes than you have positions by far, which is true of men as well, but even more so for the women. That when we're looking at compliance, we really look at that prong 1. Are they providing those substantially proportionate opportunities? And, where we are now is 90% of Division I universities are not.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So we have widespread non-compliance over 50 years later. When it has been enforced, if it ever has, how has it been enforced?
Well, it was interesting. In the first panel, someone asked, how is how do we expect this now that there's no longer a Department of Education and who knows what's happening with the OCR? What's going to be the enforcement mechanism? And, in my head, the answer to that was the same enforcement mechanism we've had the entire time. It's on the backs of these students and, or their parents sometimes if they're not 18, but it falls to the women to be that enforcement mechanism. OCR is never pulled funding, and with the resources that they had even before this administration, the best they could do were resolution agreements. And so, when we're talking about making real change, adding opportunities, forcing the schools to get into compliance, that has all come through female student athletes saying, I've had enough. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to sue the very institution where I continue to play and attend and seek a degree from.
So while there's a lot of unknowns with the current administration, Department of Ed, DOE, and the Office of Civil Rights housed within the DOE, how much does that matter going forward? Because how much have they been relied upon in sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, not much. Title IX still exists. The law, doesn't seem to be going anywhere, thankfully, and knock on wood. So, from my perspective, not much has changed about the enforcement, but it's a lot to ask of these, 18 to 22-year-old women, or, in the case of elementary schools or high schools, it's a lot to ask of, a freshman in high school to sue their school. And sure, it might be their parent, but child has to be involved because they're the one who's engaged in the sport and has the facts. So, we're putting a lot on these students to bear that.
How do these cases typically begin? Is it there a fear among women athletes to take on their own school, sue them? We know that it's the school they're working on to earn their degree.
Definitely.
Hopefully have a great experience.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever met with any group of female student athletes and, in our first initial meeting and had the question of like, what happens if like everybody on campus hates us? Is there anything to protect us? Like, could they kick me out of school? Could they kick me off the team? Could they pull my scholarship? And, my answer is the institution's not supposed to do anything and usually doesn't. I mean, I will give it to most colleges, either threatened with a lawsuit or actually sued. It's pretty rare to see retaliation at that level. They do a good job of, instructing their coaches and staff to like, do not do anything to that student that could be even slightly perceived as retaliation. It does happen, but a lot of what you see is other student athletes giving them a hard time. But, when you're asking, is it how they typically begin? Unfortunately, we're still at a place where so many student athletes, so many of the women that are my clients and that I work with, the sentiment that they continue to express is, I'm just grateful that I get to be a Division I athlete. I think about it is there has to be some sort of catalyst that gets them angry enough that they're willing to stand up and say, nope, enough is enough. And sure, I'm gonna keep being a Division I athlete. I'm gonna keep attending my classes. You're gonna give me a degree and we're suing you. So that typically looks like an elimination of a varsity team. Or, a club team going to the athletic administration and saying, we've been a club team for, 50 years and we always have more women show up for tryouts than we could possibly put on the team. We have enough interest and ability. Please make us varsity. They do this for a couple of years in a row and the athletic departments keep saying, no, we're not going to do that. It makes them angry. Or you get such disparity in the treatment and benefits that the women just look at it and be like, like, I'm being treated like crap. And, my male counterparts are being fitted for custom shoes. And I'm lucky to get one pair of tennis shoes and, one sports bra a year. Like, I can't do this anymore. This is not tenable. So you basically just have to get these women to the point where they're at their wits' end and they're willing to sue.
We know when their team gets cut, they might be in shock.
Yeah.
We know it's going back to the budget, right? Resources available. What do you say to folks who say, but football is the moneymaker? That's the largest revenue generator. That's how we fund the rest of our sports.
Well, one, I say Title IX doesn't care. Um, Title IX doesn't care where your revenue comes from. But more so than that is, there is this misconception, I will say, that football pays for itself. Football pays for our whole program. And that's not always the case. And quite frankly, in a lot of the, the Power Five, the Power Four, a lot of the FBS schools, football isn't paying for itself when you look at the coaches' salaries, when you look at, the game day operations for a football team. It's the revenue they're bringing in isn't actually covering their own expenses, let alone the rest of the athletic department. And so, a lot of these Olympic sports actually do bring in money in the form of, their student athletes paying tuition. And so it's really important to understand that the other problem here is that marketing works, right? We have this machine that has been pumping out football is amazing, men's basketball is amazing for the past 100 years. Watch it. This is the game. These are the tournaments. We're going to do these giveaway deals at the games. And marketing works for a reason. If you tell people what to watch, they will watch it. There's nowhere, women's basketball is starting to have that kind of investment just now in the past, 3-4 years, have that investment. If we say that, football's the revenue maker, why shouldn't they should be treated differently? They're a revenue maker because all you've done is market football. So if you market women's sports, you make that same investment, it's going to have better outcomes. They're going to start producing revenue. I've talked to student athletes. I've talked to students on campus so many times, and, I'll represent the women on the lacrosse team. And while we're walking around campus doing site visits, ask a student like, hey, how many women's lacrosse games have you gone to? And this is the response I get. We have a women's lacrosse team? And you go into the bookstore and there's all of this football gear. And then maybe there's like a t-shirt for women's softball, women's basketball, and nothing else. So nothing's being done to publicize these. Of course, you don't have people showing up to the games. They have no idea they're happening.
It's sort of treated like a club sport. If
Yes.
you can't buy the tickets, you don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
Who's going to show up? And has it ever really been presented as a product? We know with the broadcast agreements, women's game has been given away as a +1 freebie
Yep.
for so long.
Yeah. And, so many of the universities that I've, sued, when we obviously start doing discovery, which is a fancy lawyer word for giving all of your data. But, I dig into it, and the only women's team that has a marketing budget is basketball. None of them do. I've seen schools where the men's soccer team, men's tennis team, men's golf team, they have marketing budgets, and the only team with a marketing budget is the women's basketball team. So, you can see where the investment is.
Yeah, we're going to jump up in interest of time to the NCAA and then, of course, the House.
Yeah.
You have represented women athletes having to unfortunately sue their institutions, their schools. What's the NCAA's role? What has their role been in this? Have they played a part or even created this situation?
to anybody who's an NCAA, supporter, sorry, but I mean, the NCAA's role in this is they've made everything worse, I think. Not everything, but, I've represented over 200 women in the last 5 years from 19 different institutions. And the NCAA had, it ends up being either the cause or exaggerating, or, it makes everything worse in terms of the school being able to comply with NCAA rules, being able to still have eligibility for their student athletes and comply with Title IX. So, the NCAA, unfortunately, is not subject to Title IX. The Supreme Court held that many years ago, over 10 years ago now. Because they're not subject to Title IX, despite being made up of member institutions, they don't have to follow these rules, and they don't seem to care that the universities do. And so they create these impossible situations for the institutions where if you don't comply with NCAA rules, none of your student athletes get to play. But if you're in compliance with NCAA rules, you're almost certainly out of compliance with Title IX.
Interesting. So to comply with NCAA bylaws makes it even more difficult to become in compliance with Title IX.
Yeah, like take, for example, the athletic financial aid. They've talked about it in one of the panels earlier this morning. Every conference has, their minimum sports that you have to sponsor. If you sponsor football, most of that's 6 sports on the men's side. The NCAA has all of the scholarship limits. So even institutions where they're really trying, they're sponsoring 6 men's sports, they're sponsoring 12 women's sports to try and get there. If they max out the NCAA scholarship limits for all of their sports, it's impossible. They're never, ever going to get to compliance because you don't have, like you have with men's football of the 85 full ride scholarships, you don't have anything like that on the women's side where, and I'm not talking about having 85 scholarships, I'm saying that the number of scholarships that the schools are permitted to award in proportion to the average team size is nowhere near what you get with the 85 men being full ride scholarships.
Right.
So they've made this situation where you sort of have to pick your poison as an institution.
Right. Interesting. So I'm going to jump to the House case now,
Yeah.
the House versus NCAA case. I'm sure a lot of you know what that's about, but I'll tee this up with a little lay of the land, and I promise there's a question at the end.
Yeah.
So this case is ironically brought by an Olympic swimmer, Olympic athlete, Grant House from the Arizona State University, and a women's basketball player, Sedona Prince, as the plaintiffs. We know we had fairness hearing this past Monday in front of Judge Claudia Wilken in the Ninth Circuit. And although it wasn't settled, it looks to be headed that way with some possible tweaks to the settlement agreement. So some of the key provisions, we know that there's the back pay portion of it, the looking back, where athletes who played between going back to 2016 will receive approximately 2.8 billion distributed over 10 years. We know that it will allow direct compensation, where schools can now directly compensate athletes for their NIL. We know that the big revenue sharing piece, which we're going to dive into, is a big piece of it. The looking forward framework, where conferences and schools can pay athletes with up to 20.5 million over the 10-year agreement, increasing by 4% each year. Of course, we talked about roster limits, and the athletes can continue with NIL deals. So looking at that back pay formula, we know that the agreement that's proposed is that 75% of the back pay will go to football players, 15% to men's basketball players. And if you're doing the math, yes, we're already at 90%. And 5% to women's basketball, and the remaining 5% unrestricted by sport or gender.
Yeah.
At the school's discretion. So the attorneys and the judge have made it clear in the hearing that this case is about antitrust.
Yeah.
Right? That it's despite the equity going to athletes, Title IX isn't a part of the case. How can that be?
Well, I think the short answer is I believe they're wrong. if we look at it, the back portion, just as damages, it seriously undermines, the opportunities that I think women could, it underestimates the opportunities women could have had. And again, we go back to the issue of this does nothing more than perpetuate that system where you're publicizing men's sports, you're promoting men's sports. So those are the student athletes that are getting the NIL deals. And then, you've created, basically we're just entrenching that system in this settlement. But so, maybe if the parties and the court is looking at the back pay as purely damages, and we're not gonna look at it as subject to Title IX, there might be an argument for that. Where I can't wrap my head around how Title IX doesn't apply is the revenue sharing going forward. And, we've got money that's going to be coming to the schools. The schools have the discretion of how they want to divvy that up. We already have schools who are, announcing that they're going to alter that formula a little bit. They're not going to give, the 5% to women's basketball. They're going to give some lesser percentage, or they've already announced how they're going to spend the other 5%. And it's not going to be equally to men's and women's sports, the remaining men's and women's sports. But it seemed, at least during the hearing to me, that the judge wanted assurances that this money wasn't going to be coming from the schools and was, just sort of took at face value that it's coming from the NCAA. So it can't be subject to Title IX. And if that's the case, that opens a whole host of issues, because all the institutions have money coming from the NCAA for every student athlete they have. They have money coming from donors. They have money coming from media contracts, right? All of that, then the school makes intentional decisions about what money are we going to spend on women's programs and what money are we going to spend on men's programs. And the only thing preventing them from, investing that all in football or all in men's basketball, whatever their sport may be at each institution, is Title IX. They take all that money coming in and then they have to then equally distribute it. And so to say that this money, because it's going to come to the schools from the NCAA and then they have the choice of how they want to distribute it, it isn't subject to Title IX, it really baffles me. It really does.
That was interesting, right? It was brought up by some of the objectors, and it seems that the parties to the case said about those looking forward payments, sort of really key piece here, that they would be made by the NCAA and conferences. So they say there can't be a Title IX problem. So you don't agree with that?
I do not. And I think one of the panelists said it earlier today, there's probably going to be a lot of lawsuits come July after this is put into place, and if it's the settlement's approved, and I think we're about to see a lot more litigation in that area.
Interesting. So have you heard attorneys who represent institutions typically give their thoughts on this?
I have, and something's wrong when I agree with the attorney who's representing the institution. So that like we never agree on anything, right? Except for that we really want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can for the students. I think even the institutions feel that way. I never sued a school that said, well, I don't care about women at all. They're just not allocating their resources in a way that vocally that actually backs that up. But there are attorneys on the other side who I would spend the rest of my life screaming at the top of my lungs that they're wrong. I won't name names, but they also think that the going forward Title IX absolutely applies. They're advising their clients that Title IX applies. So there's got to be something wrong when we both agree on the same thing.
And up until now, it's been about participation, straight up.
Yeah.
I have the opportunity to compete.
Yeah.
It's about treatment and benefits. Now that there's real money involved, do you think young women, their families are going to think, whoa, wait a second. Before we were suing for this and that was difficult enough, but now we have a lot of money flowing.
I hope so. I hope this pisses off every female student athlete who has been sitting there buying, her own sports bras, her own running tights, her own socks, her own second pair of shoes to say, I'm sorry, the third string player on the football team is getting paid how much on top of everything else that they're getting? And I have to tell you, the one thing that I always tell universities and the one thing that my clients always tell me is I don't want the men to get less. That's not what we're going after here. I think it's great that they get everything they do. I just want it too, right? We can do this in a way. And, I point to Clemson University as a school that I didn't litigate because they were smart and said, we don't want to engage in litigation. That's not a good use of our resources, but they're doing it. They're dedicating the funds to their women's athletic program. They added 2 new women's varsity teams as a result of women coming forward and saying, hey, we deserve equity. So it's possible to do it without taking away from the men's team and from their experience, just making a conscious effort to elevate the women's experience to an equal experience.
We've seen the market prove itself over and over again, it seems.
Yes.
What Dave Ridpath said earlier about the old institutional mindset of amateurism, it seems it applies, treble against women,
Yeah.
right? And how they're looked at
Yep.
as potential markets. So do you think this is a case of, you don't, telling the women, you don't or you didn't have an advocate at the table, especially in this House case, someone there with hard data that they lost out?
Yeah. I mean, I know that, both of the attorneys representing the athletes have said they didn't think Title IX applies. Their expert didn't do an analysis on the, how this would affect gender equity. So they really, unfortunately, didn't have an advocate at the table thinking about what does this do in terms of leveling the playing field for men and women in college sports.
How will that affect girls and women's sports, you think, in the next decade? What will happen at the college level now?
I mean, what my fear is that the way that it's going to affect men, women's sports is that it's going to slow the progress that we've, started to make. Is that, like I said, the settlement sort of entrenches this idea that men's football is worth more, should be, allocated more resources, given more attention. And so, the progress we've made through the March, Women's March Madness and, the promoting women's sports and promoting Title IX is going to kind of slow to a crawl. And we're going to have to rely on hundreds of female student athletes to once again step up and say, hey, we're here and you need to make this investment in us. It's going to pay off. I promise you. And, it's going to have to be a situation where, it's going to be a hard fought battle.
Right. And you think about the conference realignment, some people call the transfer portal for schools.
Yeah.
They're these sacrifices that athletes are making now, traveling coast to coast. I heard a story of a Stanford women's volleyball player this year. I got her schedule. Someone sent it to me. She was on the road with her team, of course, 10 days in the middle of the season, not even championship season. The Oregon article in the Wall Street Journal about how the men's basketball team traveled, circumnavigated the planet leading up to March Madness. Yeah. The women are doing the same schedule because they're also in the same conference now. So they're making the same travel, work, sacrifice to their physical, mental, and academic work. And then you just mentioned how the women surpassed the men in the tournament viewership. It was just 2 years after they were able to use the March Madness trademark.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody's been talking about it's chaos right now. And, putting these student athletes in a position where on top of, everything else that they already do, they're now going to have to be the ones advocating for their civil rights. I don't think this is where we thought we'd be 50 years ago when Title IX was passed.
We could ask someone in the room.
Yeah.
I'm going to end it on that because we want to get to a few Q&A if you have any questions for us. But if you were to ask someone, Lori, who's been working in the space since the 70s when the law was passed, you could say Billie Jean King or Donna Lopiano, who we happen
Yeah.
to have in the room. Where do you think we'll be in 2025, or do you think they would say this is where we hope to be?
I don't think they would say that. I think they would say that, they hoped that we would have made more progress than we have right now. And that we wouldn't still be fighting for equal participation. We'd be fighting on things that were more nuanced than what we're looking at right now.
With that, we could go to Donna or
University of Oregon. Okay, so this is a case where I represent me and other counsel. We're a team of legal litigators, represent women from the beach volleyball team and women from the club rowing team that really want to be a varsity team. And this case is by and large a treatment and benefit. It's also participation, obviously. But this will be the first case where we're seeking anyone has sought monetary damages for the unequal treatment and benefit, and that includes NIL. That includes the work that they do with their collective, Division Street, which, somebody mentioned earlier, collectives aren't subject to Title IX. When you hear stories and you talk to student athletes about the coach said that I would get this NIL deal from Division Street, or this, I would get this much money if I came here. There's so much coordination going on between these collectives and the universities. Half the time, their boards are made up of either all staff from the university or staff and some students. It's hard to really say that they're a distinct and separate entity at that point. So what we're hoping to accomplish is, one, make it so the beach volleyball team isn't practicing at a municipal park. They get a facility, they get a locker room, they get bathrooms where they practice with doors on the stalls. I wish I was joking. I am not. And at the same time, forcing schools to, Oregon first and foremost, but other schools to take a hard look at, what resources are we providing for NIL, and what does that relationship with our collective really look like? Can we really hold ourselves out as a distinct entity, and we have no role to play whatsoever in the deals these kids are getting?
we know women athletes, Livy Dunn, who was one of the objectors on Monday, who gave an eloquent objection
Yes.
about why would you limit, I'm a perfect example of an Olympic athlete, a woman, who's able to generate revenue.
Yeah.
We know women's teams are marketable.
Yes.
So it seems like we're artificially limiting that. at the
Yeah.
schools.
And I mean, I've talked to women, as soon as they started allowing NIL, as the NCAA did, women who were offered, their whole team was offered a deal with, Lululemon, and the university, even though they were letting, some of the men's sports do NIL, said, oh, well, let's get some more information about that opportunity. I don't really know if that's going to be something the whole team can do, and sort of drug their feet into the point where they said, well, this clearly isn't going to happen, so we're going to move on to a different institution. There are stories like that left and right from, when NIL became possible through the NCAA. And I can't imagine that there are not, brands out there, companies out there that, had this been possible, they absolutely would have marketed their product to, young girls, young women through female student athletes, because, that's their, geographic target. Right.
Right.
And so it's sad that they sort of get to run this analysis and just undermine and completely undervalue the women's contribution.
Definitely is. Any other questions?
Thoughts on, Thank you. I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on the fact that as the plaintiff's attorneys say that, Title IX does not apply, but there's still an inclusion of a Title IX's release in the damages portion. So what does that mean and realistically for women athletes moving forward in their ability to kind of remedy past damages and civil rights violations if the House settlement is approved?
Yeah, so, and, I have colleagues that have had conversations with the plaintiff's attorneys from House on this specific issue because, we're in active litigation, like with Oregon, with San Diego State University. If our student athletes accept the money, however measly it may be, like what does this do for their Title IX claims? And they continue to insist it doesn't apply, even though they're waiving the claims. I think, the argument that the best argument we've got moving forward is that, the waiver of the Title IX was at best, for the NIL claims that existed at the time that the settlements approved, and didn't waive any future claims for how the universities choose to distribute money, but that's going to have to be a battle that we have in court and have to convince, one district court after another that, they didn't waive their claims. The only sort of saving grace about this is that it is an automatic class. They don't have the opportunity to opt out and so, it's going to be, I think that'll make it easier in some regards, but it's going to be the kind of thing we're going to have to fight for the next few years.
One more question over here.
So for this future, the opting in for $20.5 million for year one and moving up, if some or any or all of this money comes from institutional support, which is another term for tuition, if it comes from institutional support instead of from boosters or the local Ford dealership or whatever, how can it possibly be argued that Title IX wouldn't apply?
I don't think it can at all be argued that Title IX wouldn't apply. And which is why, I think both Julie and I found it unsettling when the NCAA, counsel for the NCAA said, no, the money's going to be coming from the NCAA. Where do they think the NCAA gets money? From the member institutions. So it, but if we're talking about tuition dollars, that makes the argument even easier that absolutely Title IX applies.
At a time when student debt is an all-time high as well.
Yes.
So I think my question is related, but now thinking about the top tier where it's not tuition dollars that are coming for the revenue share. So I'm hoping you can resolve my moral dilemma, right? So Title IX is a legal requirement, but it's a moral one also, right? That there be equal opportunities for women in sport. What I have to balance that with is that for the Ohio states, et cetera, in 2025, the disproportionate share of revenues are coming from football, some from basketball. The disproportionate number of athletes are African-American athletes who disproportionately come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So what's the balance between how much you provide cases won't have a professional career, but this could be life-changing money for them in terms of their future career?
I would add, when you look at sports across the board, where you might traditionally see more underprivileged, if you want to break it down by race, Black and brown athletes, track and field. So you're also putting the women, their opportunities at risk as well, right? Their ability, if a scholarship was their way to go to the Ohio State University, those opportunities would go by the wayside and have for so long. So I think it is a struggle, right, when you try and catch the women up. But we know that the resources and And the benefits are disproportionately going to the men. And yeah, it's a problem we need to figure out.
Yeah.
Hello. So, hey, I'm Dr. Jen Fry, and I just want to say kind of to that question is that we have to stop acting like it's a zero-sum game,
Yep.
that we're putting Black people against women. Because whenever we make a zero-sum game, nobody wins. So the reality of the question is, what do we have to ask is this idea of what do we need to do to make sure both groups are uplifted at the same time? We cannot continue to pit Black men against women to say, Black men, because you've been working, you deserve this, and women, because you haven't gotten opportunities, you need to push Black men aside. We have to stop doing that and really figure out how do we make everyone win together.
Thank you.
I'd agree. I was delighted when I saw one of the men's swimming NCAA championship relays this year from University of Tennessee was 4 Black men. You like to see that across the board in other sports, and we want more.
Yeah, absolutely. And equity is not a pie. It's not how it works.
One more question, Ellie.
I thank you guys so much for speaking. This has been extremely interesting. I have a question about the distribution of NIL funding as we start to move forward. Obviously, men are going to be getting significantly more NIL deals than women, right? And it's coming from private sector. How do we ensure that, like, is there a way to legislate NIL and private money coming in so that female athletes are able to get invested in a way that we currently see, like, at least on my campus, right? Like all the male athletes starting to get all of these endorsements and deals coming in, and compared to the amount of female athletes getting it on my campus, it's significantly lower. And are there ways for us to almost quantify the potential return on investment that we could get from investing in female athletes in order to kind of minimize this discrepancy?
I mean, if I was an economist, I'm sure that I could do that analysis for you. And I mean, the answer is yes, there's always a way to quantify, you know, what that opportunity could look like for women had we made the same investment for the last, I mean, I would say 100, but 10 years, 20 years, you know, had we made the investment in women's sports that we've made in men's sports, what kind of opportunities would be available for those women? There is a way to quantify that. But I think, you know, the short answer here is that I don't know that there's a way to legislate that and without having some sort of enforcement mechanism, which we wouldn't have right now. And the other part of that is that, you know, everybody sort of, when you were talking about antitrust, when we're talking about, you know, people wanting to use a student's name, image, or likeness, they're doing that, you know, because the market demands that. And the market's not going to demand something else until we start making the same investment in women's sports that we're making in men's sports. And like we've said, we've seen that with March Madness, right? Where then we're going to have the demand, but I think it'd be very difficult on a national level to really legislate that in a way that would be effective.
All right, thank you. I think with that, oh, one more.
Yeah.
Squeeze one more in.
Thank you. I'm curious on kind of a grassroots level, is there anything that high school athletes can do to be better prepared as they look at colleges or questions to ask recruiters? And maybe what's the barrier once they arrive at college? Do they even know what their resources are? How can we better educate athletes that are getting there and all of that?
I mean, I wish that the first barrier is that most female student athletes have no idea what their rights are. They have no idea what Title IX requires. They're sitting there thinking, look at this really cool backpack with these shoes and these shorts and these t-shirts that I just got, you know, and then maybe they see on Instagram, you know, the gear drop that the football players got and think, well, they got a lot more than me, but like maybe they're allowed to do that. It's because they have no idea what their rights are. So the first thing we need to do on a basic level is just educate every high school woman that this is your rights when it comes to Title IX. This is what you can walk into the building and you should be demanding. You shouldn't settle for, I'm really grateful that I get here, I get to play here. Because you know who's not settling for that? The men. The male student athletes are not settling for, I'm really grateful that I get to play here, and in part because they don't have to anymore, right? So, I wish that every high schooler knew about the Equity and Athletic Disclosure Act website, which may or may not continue to exist, who knows? But you can go and you can look. How much is the college that I'm looking to attend? Where are they in terms of substantial proportionality for participation? It's really easy to look that up. How much are they spending on recruitment of female student athletes versus recruitment of male student athletes on a per student basis? There's a lot of public data out there that these students have no idea one even exists or how to access it, how to utilize it. And so I wish that, recruiting came with a Title IX primer, basically, because that's the barrier we need to overcome, is just them. Every time I talk to a new set of clients, it doesn't matter if there's 6 women in the room or 30 women in the room. They're all like, really? Like, that's what the federal law requires? That's what the case law says we're supposed to be getting? I'm not getting that. I'm not getting anywhere near that. So, it's just, we have to start educating women very young.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Lori.